All right, welcome to another episode of the Black on Black Education podcast. For those of you who have been here for a while, this is the first interview based conversation that we've had in quite some time. So I am super excited to kick things off with our guest today. I would love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners, talk to them about who you are, what you do, and why you do it.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation. My name is Dr. Donna Nicol. Currently, I'm the Associate Dean of Personnel and Curriculum at California State University, Long Beach. I've been in this role since January of this year after a 20-year career as university faculty. And prior to that, I taught junior high, uh, middle school, social studies and language arts in Los Angeles Unified School District, and I had some administrative jobs in between there. Um, and I'm the author of a new book called Black Women on Board, Claudia Hampton, the California State University, and the Fight to Save Affirmative Action.
Mm.
I've been working on this book for a long time. So happy that it's finally here. Um, but it's really part of my research commitment to documenting the history of uh, Black women as educational activists. Um, and when I say educational activists, I'm not specifically talking about people who are in the classroom, but I'm talking about people who are trying to effect policy change. And so I'm really interested in the ways in which Black women, in particular, shape policy and craft policy and implement policy to the benefit of our community in particular. Um, and so that's part of my research interest, but it's also part of kind of reaching back to the way I was raised. I was raised by a community activist, and so this research ties into honoring the work of my grandmother and my mother, who helped to deal with food insecurity in our community,
Mm.
helped to deal with economic development for Black folks by creating a Black supermarket training program in the 1970s.
Wow.
So it's kind of a continuing of honoring that kind of work.
That is so incredible. And there are so many things just in there that we could have a full podcast episode about.
Yeah.
So, like, so many things in there. One, we've got an educator through and through that is here for an episode of the Black on Black Education podcast. So if you do not have your popcorn ready, make sure that you do that because I think it's gonna get real good in here. Um, Also, you already talked about kind of that rich tradition of Black on Black education, which we talk about on this podcast all the time, where it is not always in the classroom. Honestly, a lot of the learning, majority of the learning that we do as individuals doesn't happen just in our classroom. So thinking about the world as our teacher, and you taking on and saying, hey, yeah, I've seen generations before me show up and think about community and educating the community and supporting the community in holistic ways. And I'm going to pick up that mantle and I'm going to keep going from there. So shout out to the Black women. We just gonna start there. Y'all already know what type of time we're on. And I would love for you to like dig into what it feels like to do this work at this time. Before we started recording, it was just like, this is such a timely conversation. I think that had we recorded when we were supposed to, we wouldn't be having this conversation because the shifts in the political landscape have just changed so much since that time. So everything happens exactly the way it's supposed to be. And I would love for you to dig in a little bit of like, what does it feel like for this to be your research focus, for this to be kind of your life's work, and then us looking at this upcoming election and what that means for the future of this country.
Yeah, I can see a direct line between what happens in the classroom, what happens on campuses, and what happens in the Capitol. Like there is you know, we often, in sociology, we talk about the kind of three levels of existing. So you have the micro level, the meso level, which is the community level, and the macro level. And we always miss the meso level, which is that in between stage that really deals with community and how do you define yourself in relation to your community. And that's where Black women thrive, is at the community level. And I think that in order to have the kind of impactful change that, say, a Kamala Harris is having on our, political landscape right now, she had to uh, be nurtured by a community
Mm,
to give you the kind of confidence to and to own who you are,
mm,
to walk into spaces. And we talk about imposter syndrome, but a lot of what a lot of sisters are dealing with is not imposter syndrome, it's actual disrespect.
mm.
And so if you don't have that psychic armor given to you by the other women in your community, you are really ill prepared to go into these predominantly white spaces and command the respect of these folks. And so I think it's important for Black women in particular and Black girls to, um, even though we always talk about the having this macro level impact, or being very individualistic because that's American culture,
Mhm.
we miss out on community and uplifting this idea of working toward community development.
Yeah.
And so I think at this particular moment in time, kind of reaching back to study the history of Black women, helping the community put things in place to get us to a position where we can have Kamala Harris running for, I mean, being a really viable candidate running for
Yeah.
presidency. Like if there wasn't a Shirley Chisholm, there was not going to be a Kamala Harris. If there
Absolutely.
weren't women and there were a number of Black women who have tried to run for president at various times. There was a woman here in California named Charlotta Bass who ran one of the first Black independent newspapers called the California Eagle. And she ran on the independent ticket. To try to get the nomination. And so if people hadn't taken all those kind of incremental steps, um, there would be no possibility of Kamala running. And so
Mm.
I think it's important for us to know the trajectory of Black women. Black women have been working, step by step, brick by brick, to get us to this place where we can affect change at a global level.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's just so powerful to really think about our identities as Black women and recognizing how important it is for us to live into the rich traditions that have all 1 second, I'm so sorry, that have always existed in our society. So I think the next question for me is I kind of want us to go back so that we can go forward, right?
Mhm.
So for folks who are thinking about um where they stand, where they sit, the ways that they can enact real and practical change in their own lives, what do we need to look back to? Because I think I
Mhm.
have a lot of conversations with people these days, particularly as it relates to kind of political activism and social activism and the work that individuals are doing, that organizations are doing in isolation in some cases. And there's a real difference between what that looked like in the 60s, right? And not having kind of those beacons of light, those individuals that we're looking at and saying, okay, these are the steps that we're going to take. These are the organizations that we're going to follow. It's just so disjointed because there is so much of it. And so there's a lot of power and excitement in the fact that there's so many people doing the work, but there's also kind of a decision paralysis that comes from some of us around who do I support or who do I look to? So if we're looking back, what are the sorts of things that we need to do in terms of creating communities that are doing this work, and looking back on those rich traditions that were already implemented for us, and looking into our history and how we can start to replicate those sorts of things, and
Mhm.
then also how do we just kind of build on the work that again so many people are doing in isolation, that needs to begin to start to come together, to create the collective good that we're looking for. So I think ultimately my question is, what are some of the who are some of the people, what are some of the movements, what are some of the organizations historically we should be looking at and thinking to, and kind of building on the tenets that they built in the 60s to try to redevelop and reinvigorate some of the movements that we know are extraordinarily necessary in current times.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And I actually would say we probably got to go back before we even get to the 60s, because you see the Black Woman Club movement of the 1920s and 30s. You see the Harlem Renaissance, the Chicago Renaissance. You have all the various ones, the formation of the NAACP
Mm,
in that time period. So you have an infrastructure that Black people had started building actually in the 1800s. You have the Free African Society out of Philly, where you get the AME Church, but you also get some of the first historically Black colleges that were created by Black people, not the ones created by white folks. Uh, so this is how you get Wilberforce and so forth. So we were institution building in the 1800s, usually in the North to begin. Philadelphia is a prime example of this.
Absolutely.
So, we had a mechanism where Black folks could pool their money together, pay to the Free African Society. That's actually 1787. Now I'm thinking about it, where people would pay like a equivalent of $1. And that they would pool those resources together for this kind of mutual aid society where they could bury their own, they could bury their dead. They could have like some kind of health care insurance. There was some programs to help orphan children. So there was a sense of collective destiny during that period that meant that we would have to kind of move in tandem with each other. Then you also had the Freedmen's Bureau after slavery had ended, and you had the Freedmen's National Bank, where Black people had pooled within 1 year over $1 million in deposits into this bank. These are newly freed Black folks pulling this money together. Now, there was no FDIC protection, so when that white dude ran off with their money, they only got cents on the dollar. But it shows the power of Black people wanting to enact their citizenship rights and to be full participants in American society, but all these barriers were erected. But I think there was, like I said, that collective destiny ethos, and that carried all the way to the 1960s. And so, as you come out of slavery and we go into the Reconstruction period, Black people they're using institutions like the church. They're using institutions, eventually the NAACP, what is the group that Sojourner Truth, not Sojourner Truth, sorry. Ida B. Wells and company create to help Black women get the vote. So we can build on those things. It's not like we don't know that they exist. Carter G. Woodson creating, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History in 1915, which ended up giving way to Black History Month. And, the Black History kits that he used to sell to Black folks so they could teach our history. We can keep building on those sort of things. The Black boarding school movement that was quite prominent. Honestly, I really think that a lot of Black children need to be in Black boarding schools because they need safe places to learn and to play and to grow. So we have this long history of institution building, but we also, what we're running up against is we don't have the collective memory about this, and it's not being taught. And one of the problems that I've had as an academic, as a historian, is that we focus on slavery and civil rights, and we miss that section in between.
Absolutely.
What did the guy call it? The nadir period of American race relations, which it means the lowest point in American race relations, when you have an uptick in lynching and rape of Black women and disenfranchisement after slavery. But Black people still are institution building because they know they can't do anything one-on-one because that's how you pick people off. So I think that what happens in American history, the way it gets taught, is that it's this triumphant narrative of white folks. Like they triumph over their sin of slavery by freeing the slaves, so to speak. And then they triumphed again by passing the Civil Rights Act. But they miss all of the horrors that they created in those between periods. And
Yeah,
so it's this atonement story. And then what ends up happening is, because they only focus on slavery and civil rights, is that we don't get to hear about what we did to survive all that stuff in between.
absolutely.
And so I think
Absolutely.
documenting those histories, and Black folks have been documenting it, but
For sure.
it has not really um, made its way into the curriculum. So I'm from Los Angeles, and for a long time, most history departments in universities here would not allow the teaching of Black history, and so Black folks had to create their own study club
Yeah.
in order to read and learn about their own history.
Hmm.
And so we have to take that example and replicate it. And so the ASALA, which is the Carter G. Woodson organization, has these branches all across the United States, but
Yeah.
it's mostly older Black folks in there. We don't have enough young people
Mm.
interested in our own history. I teach on a campus, they've got Black students, and I'm trying to say hello to them, because that's how, I was raised. You see another Black person, you nod your head at least. And
Absolutely. Acknowledge.
these kids don't have it. And so I'm
Mm.
looking at them like, you ain't gonna speak to me? And so because of that absence of being taught, that you have a history to be proud of.
Mm.
So I think that, one, we definitely need to find vehicles by which we teach our kids this history, whether we go back to the Saturday schools or the freedom schools that we used to have.
Absolutely.
We go to boarding schools, whatever we got to do in order to make sure our kids know that history, because they have to be affirmed, because they're going to be torn down when they enter into these institutions.
We know that. Absolutely. I mean, I'm in the classroom every day. I work in classrooms that are predominantly Black and brown, and I'm trying to do exactly what you're talking about, right? Open up the idea for students around this pride we should have in our history, although there are these extreme bouts of extraordinary oppression. There's a reality that for us to still exist, there has to be something to be proud of. Like,
Yes.
there's no way for those two things not to exist at the same time. And it's a
Mhm.
large part of why this organization is called Black on Black Education. We talk all about student-centered practices, but it's because we need educators, whether they are Black or not, to recognize the deep importance of the tradition of Black education in this country. And not
Mhm.
only the ways in which we have learned in this country, but also how we have shaped what education looks and feels like in a real and consistent way. They came from the North during Reconstruction and said, hey, we're going to come down here and teach y'all. They said, we've been doing that.
Yeah.
We, you coming in here to fix something that we've been doing.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that it's so powerful, a lot of what you're saying. And I think, like you said, collective destiny, how powerful would it be for us in this moment to be able to look at each other and see each other and acknowledge each other in real ways, whether or not we know each other, and see and know and understand that we have a collective destiny that we have to co-create. Not that it's just sitting there waiting for us, that we have to sit and revolutionarily think about what that can look like for us. And I think that there's a lot of us that in many ways have begun to say, okay, well, let's look at things from this individualized nature, because that's what we're seeing from our society. But the only way for us not to recreate the same things in society that we do not want for ourselves,
Yeah.
we have to acknowledge the idea that we can't be individuals. We've never been culturally individual based people. And so if
Yeah.
we try to abandon our collectivist nature to seek an individualized status quo that has been developed by our American, our Western society, that we're really going to continue to see the institutions that we did build crumble, and we're not going to be able to see the ways that we can best support each other. And so, I mean, there's so many things that I want to get into, so I'm trying to like collect myself, because there's just so many things. And those of you who are listening, like, whether you went to college, didn't go to college, if you skipped all those Africana studies classes, you're getting one right now. Like, so I hope you're listening and you're going back and you're writing down the things, because there's a bunch of things that I heard for the first time and I'm like, I got to go get a book. Um, and so I mean, I think I want to start getting into education specifically, right? I know that
Mhm.
you're on the higher education side, but you have been in the classroom. And I'm
Mhm.
just wondering, what are some of the things, whether someone teaches history or not, what are some of the things from a like practical perspective, things that you're doing in the classroom, actually teaching students in real time, and just like the disposition or the mindset or intentions that educators are coming into the classroom with. What are some of the things with this in mind, this time period that we're in, where not only is it 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, where people are trying to ban the conversation around Black history, but currently, present day, we are dealing with that. What are some of the things that you want educators to leave this conversation knowing, feeling, and deeply thinking about?
I really, what do I want them to think about or come away knowing? Um, hmm, that you can teach American history, you can read against American history. And what
Mm,
I mean by this is that, you know, because of states' teaching standards and all of those things that you're required to do in order to, help the kids pass the test, because of No Child Left Behind, you can still teach counter narratives. You can teach them, what the book says, and you can teach them the counter narrative to go right alongside it. And I think that what happens is that um, I think particularly with the teaching of history, when students are always coming to me and saying, I hated history until I took your class.
mm-hmm.
And it's like, why did you hate it? And they said, because it wasn't taught as a story that I could kind of latch onto. I didn't see myself in the story, and I did not know that I could be a knowledge producer also.
Mm,
And so building activities that force students to do knowledge production, it was that was the way I taught.
yeah.
So I taught a class called Black Movements of the 60s for a number of years. And my approach was like, okay, here's what a textbook would say about the 1960s. And
Yeah.
here is the Black narrative about the 1960s. And I'm going to call it, we're going to refer to it as the freedom struggle,
Mm,
because it was not civil rights. It was literally about getting our freedom. And that's different. Civil rights are things that you should be able to walk down the street and be free from violence.
yeah.
And so then after we would get that foundational understanding of here's the narrative, here's the counter narrative, now we are going to enact some agency here, and you're going to
Mhm.
create projects where you're going to create something new. Whether I had students doing things like using software where they would input like these two like not AI characters, but characters to talk to each other, like in a
Mm,
boardroom or something like that. And so they would have to integrate that history into these conversations. Let me give you an example of one that I had that's sticking out to me. um, I gave the students a prompt and said, you are working for CBS and you have to pitch a new television show about Black people.
mm,
And it's going to talk about the 1960s, but you're in the present moment.
yeah.
How do you talk to a completely clueless white male who's in charge of CBS about how you're going to talk about a show about the Black Panther Party, for example?
Wow.
And so they would
Powerful.
have to integrate what they learned and then also some analysis on what they think that conversation would sound like. And so I did not want students to walk away from my classes without the praxis part of it.
Yes.
Like give them something very practical to do. I also had the students learn how to debate, and they had to
Mhm.
follow the Lincoln Douglas debate protocol. And so we would go over it, and I would, like, okay, we would set aside time in class where you would have somebody make the opening statement, somebody who would have or who would refute it, and so they had to answer in the affirmative or in the negative. And so teaching them those skills alongside teaching them this content.
Yeah.
So the counter narrative is a powerful place for educators to go, you're teaching them what the test is going to say, but you're
Yeah.
going to teach them the counter narrative and to teach them to look for counter narratives.
Yes.
Because what people present to you is not the only way that this story, the only lens is going to be this, this one kind of perspective. Um, so I'm hopeful that what people really gain from this is that uh, counter narratives are very useful to hooking the students in, getting them excited. Like, I see myself in this, and
Yeah.
then now I have to apply it because I'm going to end up in a boardroom one day and I'm gonna have to defend my folks
Absolutely.
or my existence in this company.
Absolutely. And I again, every time you talk, I'm just like, wait, there's so much there. There's so much there. I mean, the practical tips that I'm hearing for educators that teach in any context is ensuring that you are interacting and engaging with the skills that students need to be successful. So when you are culturally responsive, trauma informed, so all of the buzzword educators, right? If
Mm-hmm.
you are that, it is a requirement not only to get your students to the standard that the folks that don't want to see them win have created, but
Mm-hmm.
also ensuring that they are prepared to use the skills that you've taught them to create the life that they want for themselves and for their families and for their communities. It keeps coming back to that community collectivist nature around
Mm-hmm.
needing for our educators to recognize that our job, yes, in order for our schools to get their lights turned on and all the things that we have to unfortunately move through this system that we may or may not agree with. But further than that, there are people in front of us. And
Mm-hmm.
those people in front of us are going to go out into the world and they are going to shift what it looks like as we move forward. And so back to our conversation around creating that collectivist idea around what our collective destiny is, we have to really take the time to say, whether this is math, science, history, ELA, PE, to connect it back to the real ways that the skills that you're teaching them are going to be implemented in their lives in the future. I want for us to shift into talking about the book so that
Mm-hmm.
folks can get that thing and get so much more of what they're already getting in this conversation right now. Can we talk about what the book is about? I know that you said it's been a long time coming, so talk a little bit about that process for you and what
Yeah.
kind of modern changes in the ways that our society works have influenced what the ultimate project looks like, and
Mm-hmm.
what folks are going to get out of it when they pick it up, not if, when they pick it up. The link will be in the show notes, to ensure that we are not only supporting a Black woman, but we are also continuing to armor our toolkit to best support, again, the students, because that's why we're doing this.
Yeah. So thanks for that. So this book is really a book about the history of the implementation of affirmative action. So there's passing a law, and then there's implementation of a law. And too often people forget that folks have to fight not only to get the law passed, but also to get it implemented. If you look
Yes.
at the Brown versus Board of Education decision, it does not get implemented until way later. And you got to put little kids on the line in Arkansas with the Little Rock Nine. That's a
Mm-hmm.
test case. And these kids had to be psychologically prepared for the trauma and the violence that they were going to have to deal with. Daisy Bates actually prepped these kids and their families for what they would
Mm-hmm.
have to endure. So
Imagine.
the when we say that, like, the long civil rights movement, the long civil rights movement includes the implementation of laws. And so in this case, this book really looks at the California State University system and the fight to implement affirmative action.
Mm.
And so affirmative action gets passed with an executive order. That's easy. The hard part is making sure that the so-called liberal California
Hmm. Hmm.
actually lives up to its liberal reputation and implements affirmative action. What you
Hmm.
find in reading the book is that California is not liberal, not hardly liberal. And it's the first state in the nation to get rid of affirmative action for
Hmm.
all its liberalism. But it really traces the history of this Black woman named Claudia Hampton who fought tooth and nail to make sure that Black folks and brown folks and women got an education, or at least got the opportunity to utilize affirmative action. And I want to be clear, because a lot of people, a lot of Black folks even, which disturbs me on a lot of levels, are like, we didn't need affirmative action, and and almost in this kind of distancing themselves from affirmative action.
Yeah.
When I tell folks, look, you can call me an affirmative action hire, you can call me a DEI hire. The reason why this stuff exists is because these folks was racist. Not
Point blank.
because there was any deficit on my part. It's because of them. They created it because they knew they were wrong. So, so we need to reframe our thinking about, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and affirmative action. And so this book really looks at the ways in which this Black woman gets on this board of trustees for the California State University system, which is 23 campuses, is a massive system, and how she has to negotiate and cajole and make deals, outsmart, outwit, and outplay these predominantly white men and white women too.
Absolutely.
And so it's really a study of what Black women, after the civil rights movement ends, what they have to do in the 70s and 80s, because there's a backlash against affirmative action almost instantaneously.
Absolutely.
So it's passed in 65. It does not get implemented until 74, really nationally. And there, as soon as the Department of Education puts out rules on the implementation of affirmative action, because they had to do that because folks were sidestepping the law, here comes a lawsuit trying that makes it to the Supreme Court. It's not successful, but it's not successful on a technicality. They come back 4 years later and they narrow the focus of affirmative action with the Bakke decision. So instead of race being the factor, it becomes race can be a factor in admitting students into colleges and universities.
Yeah.
So I discovered this Black woman by chance. I was looking for information on the organization that my grandmother created, which was called the Office for Black Community Development, and stumbled across a picture of this Black woman. And at the bottom of the picture, she's in doctoral regalia. She's at a podium. And at the bottom of it says, appointed by Ronald Reagan. And I was like, wait, that Ronald Reagan? That racist Ronald Reagan who hated the NAACP, who hated the Panthers, who tried to disarm the Panthers, that Ronald Reagan? And sure enough, when he was governor, he appointed this Black woman to this position. And I said, I got to find out why. And so on this long and winding path, that's how this whole thing got started. And the reason it took so long is I changed jobs. I went from one faculty position to another campus, and then the pandemic, closed down the archive. So that's part of the reason why it's a long time coming. But what I really want readers to get from this is that Black women have been at the center of trying to make sure this country lives up to its promise. And sometimes they've had to use a radical approach, but in this case, this Black woman used a pragmatic approach. And I describe it as sly civility. And where she has to pretend to be civil with these white folks so that she can get resources that she can slyly pass to her people.
Yeah. There's so much power in staying committed to doing the work. Since the pandemic, since the we know racism still exists of 2020, right? And then there's those of us who are still shouting in the rooftops like, this is work that we still need to do. And all the other people who was putting up their black squares are like, We're still doing that? Yes, we are still doing that, because
Mhm.
historically, every time there is a push for change, there is that backlash that you spoke about. And there is a consistent need to be pragmatic. There's a consistent need to be radical. There's a consistent need to be revolutionary. And it's so exciting to hear about your book and to hear about someone using one of those methods, a Black woman using one of those methods to make real and consistent change. And the whole purpose of this podcast, over 100 episodes in at this point, is for people to decide where they belong in the movement and to
Mhm.
keep it pushing and to keep it moving forward. Whether you are in the elementary school space, teach your young people what it means that difference is beautiful, difference is incredible, and we have all of the ways that we can show up for the people that we love and that are around us. If we're talking about our middle school babies, we start to get in and to dig in on exactly what was talked about in this conversation, understanding that there's always a counter narrative, there's always another conversation, there's always another perspective, and we have to be curious enough to go out there and find it. And then we got to prepare our high school babies to go deeply out into this world and decide that they are going to bend it to their whim and in
Mhm.
whichever way makes sense for them. And so I feel super inspired to continue doing the work after this conversation. And I hope everyone listening to this feels that as well. As a reminder, in the show notes, the link to the book will be there, because we are talking about a time where there are so many of the work that was built and developed over the course of American history by Black people, by so many incredibly and powerful Black women that people are actively trying to dismantle in this moment. Actively. And so if you don't believe that because we have iPhones and this and that it's not possible in 2024, we're 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 confused, because it's always possible, becomes increasingly possible for our rights to be limited when we are not active and when we do not continue to say that we have to stand on the shoulders of giants and continue to build and create the foundation for the next generation, for the generation that is currently entering adulthood, and for every generation after that. So I am abundantly grateful for this conversation. I want to ensure that all the information to contact you and to know how to get connected with you and your work is going to be in the show notes for those who are listening to the episode. And the way that we like to end these podcasts, which I probably should have warned you about beforehand, but I think we're going to be great, is that we flip the script. You become the interviewer and I become the interviewee, of based on the conversation that we've had today, any questions that you might have for me as a middle and high school teacher, currently still in the classroom, and building Black on Black education to best support schools in uplifting student-centered practices.
Yes, I'm really curious about one of the hardest sections in my book to write was about Black on brown tensions. It took me 3 months to write one relatively little section, because I was using a lot of care and concern about how I was presenting Black and brown folks fighting.
Mm,
And I have heard and somewhat witnessed Black and brown tensions around education. And I'm
yeah,
curious if about your experience with
yeah,
that, whether it's parents, outside groups, whatever.
yeah. I teach New York, so we are talking migrants, language, culture, rate, like it's all happening here. And so it has been such an immense pleasure. Growing up, my life was very Black and white. I was around a lot of white people, or I was around Black people. There wasn't much interaction or engagement with Latine communities, Hispanic communities. And coming into teaching, it was abrupt. Like, wow, there's a whole group of people that I did not have a large kind of just baseline for. And it's been such a privilege to begin to learn so much more about the extraordinary similarities and the extraordinary, like, collectivist nature that is within that community as well, and how much shared history we have, but then almost also how much difference there is. And I think the beautiful thing, or what I've seen, having students that we put our arms right next to each other, and we have the same skin color, but I'm not Black. I've had conversations with students that I've had a student to my face tell me that he does not like dark-skinned Black women. And I'm sitting here like, you see me and you just said that and you didn't think about, okay, let's sit down, let's talk, honey. Right. And so I think that it just comes back to being willing to have the conversation and being willing to take a breath and say, hey, hold on, I don't know this. And instead of pretending that I do, let me go and ask questions. Let me go be curious. Let me create space in my classroom for us all to do the same thing. And so I think one of the most powerful lessons that I've taught to date is Facing History, incredible organization that just gives so many fantastic resources as it relates to teaching history and teaching history in a real and authentic way. They have a Reconstruction unit. And one of the lessons in the Reconstruction unit talks about a young white man who had two peers in his classroom that had the same last name as him in South Carolina or North Carolina. I might be mixing it up. And so he goes home and he asks his family, like, this is so weird. Like, why does this Black family that lives in the same town as us, that have lived here for years, why do they have the same last name? Gives them a book. And the book explains how his family was one of the largest slave owning families in South Carolina. He goes on, this never left him. He goes on to build and develop a documentary. And so he talks about names. He talks about the power of names. And he talks about how names talk to us about what history has done. And I asked my students, like, all right, well, we got a lot of Ramirez's in here, a lot of Gomez's, and a lot of, why do we think that might be? And they're like, why, miss? I don't know. I'm reading it just like y'all. Let's figure it out. And we spent another 2 weeks. Like, was it supposed to do that? No. We spent another 2 weeks. Like, wait, so Haiti and it was just so many like points of connection where they're just sitting here like, oh, we are the same. Yes, babes. We're the same. They did not. You just speak a different language and you need to teach me some. And I'm going to teach, like, we need to get locked in because there is so much similarity in our experiences. And although they're going to find different reasons and ways to polarize us and isolate us and tell us that we are so different and that you're stealing the Black job. Get it out of here, please. Get it out of here, please. We have so much more in common than we have different. And that's for everybody, but particularly for marginalized identities. And so I think for my students, I've had conversations where, oh, well, my parents, they don't let me go in the sun. They don't want me to get dark. Like those colorism, there's so much rich similarities. And so it's been obviously hurtful to have students kind of express, but also there's a great feeling in having created enough safety in my classroom where students feel comfortable to even share the worst parts of themselves, which then gives us an opportunity to collectively figure out how we get past this, right? You love Miss Eva, right? And we locked in and I love you and we're good. So explain to me again why being Black is bad. Oh, it's not. Oh, me saying I'm not Black repeatedly, where is that coming from? Why do we think that that's important for us to share, right? For me to say, I'm this, but I'm not that. Don't ever get me confused with why does it bother you to feel like you're connected to? Oh, because your parent, oh, well, where do we think our parent got that from? Now we know about this dictator in Dominican Republic and right? And they're just like, wow, I'm gonna go home and tell my mom. You do that, baby. You better come on and break this generational curse. So I think it's been hard. Like it never feels good to have somebody tell you, yeah, I don't date dark skinned women. Y'all is that don't feel great. But to go be able to take the second, take the breath. I don't even know if my response was really that cute in the moment. I was like, wait, what you like? And then I was able to collect myself and become the teacher, Miss Eva, again, and say, actually, let's learn from this moment. Let's figure this out. And so, yeah, I think those are the things that come to mind. I think there's just so much opportunity to build community and to create connection. And the only way that we're going to do that is if we create space for it. And so, yeah, maybe the curriculum says that I need to be here by that day. And you're going to just have to deal with the fact that we're not. And that what we did in here was more powerful than anything that was on that scope and sequence. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's amazing, and it makes me think about a time when I was brought in. Um, there was a group of Latinos and Asians who were going out doing canvassing, for voting,
Hmm.
and the way in which they were interacting with Black, residents, voters,
Yeah.
was very. They would come back and they would say very, racist things, and the two Black women in the group were like, "Look, this space is real. This is ignorant as hell. We
Yeah.
probably need somebody to come in." And so I came in, and I put a chart on the board that I use when I'm teaching. I encapsulate Black history in one chart,
Yeah.
and then I show it to the students. Well, in this case, I showed it to these volunteers, and I said, "Where's your history on this chart? If you can't tell me your history, you really can't say nothing about Black people."
Whew.
And I said, "So all y'all Asians, you were excluded from 1887 to 1965."
Can we talk about it?
And then the Latinos, I said, in 1947, in California in particular, you were white until 1947 by the California Constitution.
Can
And
we talk about
and then when they said, "Oh, because of your language differences, now we get to we are allowed to segregate you." And so from that, what we they understood they did not know their own history, so how dare they judge somebody else. And then the second thing in this is connected to the kind of activity you had with your students. I said, you're going to create an elevator pitch, and the elevator pitches to your family members about all the
it? Mm.
racist things that they have said about Black people.
Oof.
And so, it was like tears and snot and all the things. And these were folks who were well over 18. Most of them were 20, like between 25 and 30 years old.
Yeah.
And they were just like, I did not realize that how hurtful it was that my mother was calling my niece her little negrita, and not saying something similar to my other nieces and nephews. And
Absolutely.
so it's this continuum of debunking, this ignorance about how connected our histories are.
Yeah.
And so I really applaud you for, deviating from the curriculum in order to give them some meaningful education. And young people really need a racial literacy. And that's one of the values of an ethnic studies education, is to give you that racial literacy so that why, you know why that statement is prejudicial, or why that statement
Absolutely.
is racist, the kind of power like the power you might hold depending on a particular position that you are in. Like I tell the students all the time, I hold a whole lot of power in this classroom, but as soon as I walk into Walmart, I don't have any of it.
Hmm.
And they're just like, "What?" I said, "I don't have it because I'm just a Black woman walking through. They don't give a damn that I have a PhD at Walmart. They just want to know if I have the ability to pay for the goods and stuff." And so I said, understanding that, our the social construction of race also is dictated by time and place. So I really think it's important for educators to feel empowered enough to, like I said, use a counter narrative,
Yeah.
um, and to go off course a little bit, because once you go off course a little bit and the students know it's okay to talk about these hard topics,
Yes.
then you can get them back on track to talk about, what the curriculum says.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It just comes down to our students recognizing and understanding that we can see them, we can allow them to make mistakes. Yes, that student who told me I don't date dark skin, but I'm still not over it, honestly. Um, that student who told me that, we still have a relationship where I will post something and he is commenting on it, where he will text me if he needs something, where these college essays are coming up and I'm sure I will get a, "Miss, can you?"
Mhm.
Right. And so I did not dead that relationship because of the mistake that he made based off of ignorance. And
Yeah.
there's so many ways in which we need to continuously do that. But we also need our white people to decide and to say that I am not going to wait for my Black friend or my Black professor or the Black person in my life to
Yeah.
show me what it means to have humanity, to show me what it means to understand that, yes, I am in control of my own life up into a point, just like you and whichever privileges that you can check off and cannot are
Mhm.
in control of your life up into a point, because we
Mhm.
cannot control the behaviors of other people. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, we live in a society in which has taught all of these people, including the Black and brown ones, that there is a
Mhm.
reason for us to feel inferior. And so
Mhm.
until we decide that it is time that that is no longer the case, and we are going to learn the things that help us deeply understand that,
Mhm.
then what are we doing?
Yeah.
And so I mean, that's what I want folks to leave with in this conversation, right? Is that there is work for all of us to do. If
Yeah.
I was able to sit into this conversation and say very plainly that there's a whole bunch of historical facts as a history teacher in this conversation that I did not know, and now I have more work to do, then you for damn sure got more work to do. Okay.
Exactly. Exactly. And
Because I've made this thing my life and I still
mhm.
got work to do. So how about
Yes.
we all take the steps, right?
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I'm working on another project right now, and I'm just like, I thought I knew this stuff, and and then I was just like, girl, you're gonna be a student for the rest of your life.
Forever. What Cardi B said, forever.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so I mean, we are at the end of another episode of this podcast. This has just re-inspired, like, I got to get these interviews back because I just so enjoyed this conversation. And I hope everybody listening enjoyed it as well. And so I want, if there's anything that you want to leave folks with, now would be a beautiful time, because I mean, you gave so much already. But other than pick up the book, anything that you want to share with folks as a parting gift to your intelligence and your genius that you graciously
Oh,
shared with us today?
I kind of live by. I can't believe I live by a Henry David Thoreau quote. I said, why is this the one that sticks with me? But it's nothing is as sacred as the integrity of one's own mind.
Mm,
And the reason why it sticks with me is that one of the things that I constantly ran up against when teaching in public institutions was, or even as a student in public institutions, was feeling like my history was not validated.
mm,
And so I would have to make sure I stood firm in who I was as a Black woman,
mm,
that I knew my history, I knew my place in society, I knew the contributions of my folks. And that is something that I tell students all the time. It's, like, older folks will say, education is something that people can't take away from you, which is true.
mhm.
But I also use my education to clap back on folks, because you know, sometimes being sly and civil don't always work. I was raised in a Black radical tradition, and here I wrote a book about this Black pragmatist because I recognize that
Powerful.
sometimes pragmatism gets things done. So I hope that we can learn how to stand firm in who we are, but be open enough to explore different approaches to teaching, to social justice activism, all of those things, that kind of big umbrella, you know,
Yeah,
for Black folks, that, like that we don't have to walk lockstep like one another, but
absolutely.
we do need to honor the fact that we have diversity within our ranks.
Absolutely. And I don't think that there is a better way to leave this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your genius with us. I am super, super grateful. And I hope that all of the things, all of the good things, make it your way. So thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Black on Black Education podcast. I need you to do two things. One, share this with somebody. If you enjoyed it, why would you keep it to yourself? Again, we are a community. Please share it out. Two, give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts so that other teachers can find our podcast, listen to these conversations, and take the information and run. Thank you so much for listening. I will see y'all next week. Bye.
Bye.